And thank you all for participating in this event tonight, especially when getting here means you have to come rather closer to the lake than you would probably like on an evening such as this. On the 28th of June 2015, I met with Wang Yu, this woman in an upscale coffee shop in a mall in downtown Beijing. She's a person who had burst into the human rights scene in China in 3 years. I'd wanted to meet her. I never had, because she had been taking on some of the most dangerous and difficult cases in China, cases to do with women's rights. She took on a very dangerous case in the Islamic part of China in the northwest. And I was very, very impressed with her, talking to her because she was a woman of poise, quietly spoken, eloquent, but also one saw a woman of great courage and with an interior of steel. On the 9th of July, 11 days later, she took her husband and her 16-year-old son to Beijing International Airport, and she dropped them off. He was going to Australia to do further study to improve his English, one would like to think, for those of us with down-under accents. And then she drove back to her apartment, and a few hours later she texted a friend to say that the electricity and the internet service had been turned off in her apartment. And a little while later, she texted again, and she said, there is pounding at my front door. I think people are trying to break in. And then all went silent. Wang Yu was disappeared. That is to say, we learned that she was taken by 20 or 30 men dressed in some sort of black garb, and she was taken to some undisclosed location where she may still be, but we have no idea where that is. On the 10th of July, the next day, this man, Ping, was also disappeared. This man I've come to know very well over the last 5 years. Like many of the people I'm talking about tonight, they've been integral to the research that the American Bar Foundation has been doing on rights activism and legal change in China. This man I think of as kind of the dean of part of the human rights community, a very learned person, very thoughtful, came from a very poor background, had a great belief in the transformative power of law in China, but he also was a magnetic force, a quietly charismatic person who drew rights lawyers from all over China to Beijing to work with him. He was taken from his home. His home and his office and his staff his home was ransacked, his office, all of his files were taken away, and several of his staff, fellow lawyers, and others were taken as well. Ping has not been seen since. On the 25th of August, this man, Zhang Kai, was disappeared in Zhejiang province. This is the province in southeast China. It's a very rich province. It's a province where there are a disproportionate number of Christians. I've known him also for a very long time. He is perhaps one of the most sophisticated of China's human rights lawyers, has an elite education from the China University of Politics and Law and Renmin University, two highly prestigious institutions. He started off life as a commercial lawyer, and then, like so many of these lawyers, human rights lawyers, he went through some kind of conversion and became a passionate and extremely eloquent defender of rights across the entire country. He defended in certain environmental cases, pollution cases, cases where babies had been poisoned by additives to their milk. He was involved in HIV, hepatitis B cases. He defended migrant laborers. But in the last few months, he was best known because he was defending Protestant unofficial and official churches in the crackdown against those churches that's been going on in Zhejiang province. What made him different to the other two was that he was a master in the use of social media. So he had tens and hundreds of thousands of followers all over China on any given case, but also in his blogging in general. What was also exceptional in his case is that he was due to meet on the 26th of August the American Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Rabbi David Saperstein. Saperstein was going to meet 5 or 7 human rights lawyers and activists to hear about the religious situation in Zhejiang. And the night before, the government seized all of those that were people who were to meet with him, including Zhang Kai, and he also was disappeared. These 3 people presaged a crackdown involving hundreds of lawyers and their staffs. You can see the listing here as of a month ago, but still pretty accurate. More than 300 people were interrogated or detained or held overnight. Several of them, some dozens of them, were disappeared for a period of time. Some of them have been officially arrested. In fact, here's a listing of numbers of them as of the middle of March who'd been arrested, including Wang Yu and Melin Ping that you can see in the top row, and I'll talk about others. Their experience up to this very minute is indicative of a sharp turn for the worse. In China's law, in its legal institutions, in its civil society, and in its politics. And I think ultimately it's a turn for the worse that affects us all. So tonight I'm going to talk for a few minutes about why I believe this is an unprecedented change in China. We'll discuss for a few minutes what has been the impact of this crackdown. We'll think together about what are some of the consequences, both intended and unintended, some consequences of which have been positive. And finally, ask what does this augur for the future? As RJ said at the beginning, this is a part of a 10-year project that I've had with my Chinese co-author, Sidao Liu, at the University of Wisconsin. We've been studying the role of lawyers in effecting legal change, transformation of legal institutions in China, in a way that might push China from being the kind of authoritarian, illiberal, even despotic society that it's been, in the direction of a more open or liberal political society. So we've worked intensively with human rights activists over the last 5 years, and in the last week or 10 days I've taken the opportunity of this salon to speak to many of my sources inside China and outside China, so that tonight's comments are up to the minute. So why was this July 9 crackdown unprecedented? In the first place, it was nationwide. In the past, most human rights lawyers have been concentrated in Beijing. You probably can't see this map, but it lists all of the people that were detained in one way or another from all the provinces in China. And you can see just by the color that it essentially spanned China as a whole. Nothing so comprehensive has happened before, at least certainly since the Cultural Revolution. In the second place, it was kicked off by a media shaming episode that Wang Yu told me about at our coffee shop meeting. She said that on the 11th of June, just 2 or 3 weeks earlier, there had been a national coordinated media campaign of China's key television, CCTV, People's Daily, Xinhua News, and they had all ran the identical story, and that story was about an arrest and an imprisonment of Wang Yu. Wrongly, she said, in 2009. She was imprisoned for 2.5 years. And these articles all raised, as she said, the allegation that she, this very slight and petite woman, had beaten some people to death on the station platform in Tianjin, a port city near Beijing. She said, after beating people to death, she told me, these articles say sarcastically, how can this woman still represent justice and human rights? She said to me, they're trying to ruin my reputation online. A third chilling development has been public confessions. In an unprecedented way, high-profile rights lawyers have been put on national television to make a so-called confession. Before they've met their lawyers, before they've been charged, before they've been in a court of law. And this being tried in the media, as many commentators have pointed out, is like a recursion back to the Cultural Revolution, a public shaming of notable people. Zhang Kai, This was a television broadcast of Zhang Kai making such a confession. But in a very strange twist, I have learnt recently from my sources that numbers of the lawyers who have made so-called public confessions, they seem to have done so not only under coercion, which is probably a universal, but as this Associated Press headline says, China publicizes purported confession of Christian lawyer. Zhang Kai is a Christian, as is Melin Ping. Several sources have said, or have got the news out, that they were recorded secretly during their interrogations, and then the interrogations have been cut and spliced together to make it look as if they have made a public confession. Why has this been done? Patrick Poon, Amnesty International's a key person in Hong Kong, said the idea is not only to discredit the lawyer, the idea is to discredit the entire human rights legal community. It's to say to China's public, these people are not ordinary lawyers. These people are radicals. These people are troublemakers, and therefore you should avoid them. A fear has been realized in the last 9 months that lawyers told us about in 2012 when the criminal procedure law of China was being reformed, a reform that we've studied very closely. A new article was inserted in the criminal procedure law, Article 73, and Article 73 essentially says that if something a case involves state security, then it's permissible for the authorities to take somebody into what they call a residential surveillance. In fact, residential surveillance is nothing more or less than enforced disappearance. Melin Ping, I said, hasn't been heard of. We have no idea where he is over the last 9 months. We wonder, has he been buried in a deep hole, as a famous China constitutional law scholar wrote in the Wall Street Journal about his own experience of being disappeared. This, of course, is a kind of action that all dictatorships rely on. Being able to take somebody in the middle of the night and they disappear completely from view and nobody knows where to find them. And all the rights activists agree with what I also believe, is that once you have somebody disappeared, torture is that much easier. Torture by confession is common in China's criminal justice system. But the longer you hold somebody, the higher the level of torture can be ratcheted up. Almost certainly it is thought that these people are not only being psychologically but physically tortured. And 6 months, of course, is a long time. And so people can be bruised and cut and otherwise harmed, and wounds can heal before they're seen again in public. There's a new and also chilling development, and that has to do with overseas kidnappings. This here is Wang Yu's 16-year-old son. He was taken from Beijing airport. They never got on that plane. She didn't know that. So she and her husband, this young man and Wang Yu's husband, were both detained. The husband was also disappeared. He's a well-known lawyer. This young man was eventually released into the custody of his grandmother. But then on the 2nd of October, obviously with her agreement, 2 friends took him across the border into Burma to get away. They were then followed by the Chinese security police, and the Chinese security police found him and the 2 men and forcibly repatriated them back into China. One human rights activist said that this is one of the most disgusting incidents that this person has ever seen in 20 years of activism, grabbing a child and bringing that person back across the border. Tang Biao, the distinguished constitutional scholar, last year at Harvard Law School, this year at New York University Law School, said that to me last week, to kidnap somebody from overseas is new. It's occurred several times in the last several months, he said. 3 cases in Thailand, 1 in Burma, 1 in Hong Kong. In fact, numbers of you may have seen the headlines about the booksellers kidnapped in Hong Kong and taken across into mainland China because they were publishing books severely critical of the president of China. This young man is indicative of the deepening of what's a long-standing process in China, and that is to use family members against detainees. Wang Yu talked about how security people would often come to her house and frighten her elderly mother. The bringing back of this boy, Mong Mong, as he's known as colloquially, was especially sad because his mother was told about it on public television. And so she was filmed at the very moment that she heard that her son had been kidnapped and brought back. And this is Wang Yu being told at that very moment. But it's also the case that this man on the right, Li Chunfu, has also been disappeared. He is the brother of Li Ping and a quite well-known lawyer. Another new development has been even more troubling in some ways, and that is the supposed firing of lawyers by the people who've been detained and their replacement by state-approved lawyers. So this here is a handwritten statement from Zhang Kai from the 27th of January, sent in this envelope from the Wanzhou Public Security Bureau. And Zhang Kai is saying in his note that he's cooperating with the investigation. He's therefore firing the lawyers that he had so painstakingly lined up before he was taken, and somebody else would be replacing them. Well, this, of course, is complete nonsense. For many years, I've been talking to these lawyers. They always know that at any time they could be taken. They always have people that they trust, people that they believe are highly competent, lined up, ready to come to their defense. And now they're being replaced by compliant lawyers. Not least, and perhaps most troubling of all, since the 9th of July crackdown began, charges against these lawyers have become much more severe. In the past, lawyers in earlier crackdowns, 2007, 2011, lawyers would be arrested, lawyers would be charged, and they'd be charged with crimes essentially for disturbing the civic peace, crimes upsetting social stability. And they got mild sentences, if any sentence at all. Now, as you may not be able to see from where you sit, they're being charged with crimes of subverting state power or inciting other people to subvert state power. In a way, these charges are tantamount to charges of treason. And because they're tantamount to charges of treason, they earn much more severe sentences, between 5 and 15 years, and possibly life imprisonment. So you can see that altogether, with the combination of these unprecedented elements of the crackdown, there has been a severe ratcheting up of China's repressive security apparatus. And regrettably, for those of us who study law, some of it, like Article 73 on residential surveillance, has been done under a mantle of legality. Well, what are the impacts of this crackdown? The intended impacts seem quite clear. One is to frighten the lawyers. A second is to intimidate those other lawyers that might want to follow in the footsteps of the human rights lawyers. Another is actually to suppress the use of law as a way of redressing the huge number of grievances that hundreds of millions of people left behind in China have against their own government, to suppress the defense of rights, to suppress the advance of rights. Another intention is clearly now, as we see this week with the National People's Congress meeting in Beijing, is to strangle civil society. Any social movement independent of the state that raises its head has been knocked back. And ultimately, of course, for those of us who study legal change and the relationship between legal change and liberal legal political societies, it's to establish and re-establish and entrench the despotic power and the absolute control of the Chinese Communist Party. So how effective has this been? Is it pulling China's lawyers into what the Washington Post called a dark zone of fear? Well, one of the effects, of course, is a potential impact on lawyers. And it is to take what used to be thought of as moderate, peaceful reasonable lawyering and turn it into something quite different, a radical, extremist lawyering. So before, lawyers were able to say, human rights lawyers were able to say, we are engaged in the business of trying to peaceably resolve all those deep grievances in China over migrant workers, the environment, pollution, land takings, discrimination against women, religious oppression. They told the people, as the party had told the people, believe in the possibility of the rule of law. But the rule of law turned out to be something insurgent that the party didn't like. And now these lawyers have been declared to be outside the orbit of ordinary law, and the government clearly is shutting down law and legal institutions as paths for the orderly redress of these many deep grievances in China's society. Has it silenced the lawyers? One day after Wang Yu was taken, 100 lawyers publicly released a letter in China calling for her release. On October the 11th, 81 lawyers wrote a public letter demanding that there be some kind of information about Wang Yu's son and some guarantee of safety for him, calling on UN and other kinds of international standards. Right now, there are at least two views that people expressed to me in the last few days. One from Amnesty International is that, if anything, the rights community is strengthening. Somebody said there seems to be solidarity. They seem to be getting stronger and stronger. In fact, last Thursday, 2 lawyers actually had the nerve to bring an administrative action against authorities in Tianjin, where it's thought that Wang Yu is being held, in order to see if they could get some kind of disclosure of her whereabouts. This person said, from that angle, the crackdown has not had a deterrent effect. Tang Biao told me last week that some new people have come to fight for human rights. Some of the lawyers who've been detained and released, he said, are very brave and they continue their work. He said there is no way that this crackdown will silence all activists. Has this crackdown intimidated the public? Eva Pills, perhaps the leading authority in the world at King's College London, told me a few days ago that the government propaganda is sending out an intimidating message to the entire profession, but not to the entire profession only, to the entire nation via television, about rights advocacy being criminalized. So when lawyers are charged with subversion, that says it all. Human rights lawyers are now enemies of the state. They're enemies of the nation. They're enemies of the party. However, the underlying problems that induced those human rights lawyers to become the kinds of activists they were have not gone away. So what are the impacts on those aggrieved populations? Legal mobilization for many aggrieved populations in China was the way they decided to go after 2000. It seemed right, it was orderly, it didn't involve violence or social protests, and yet the arrest of Wang Yu sent a terrible chill through the women's rights movement because she was extremely well known among women activists. The labor movement has been targeted since December. Religion, and particularly Protestant house churches, but now even Protestant official churches are being targeted. Tang Biao said to me the other day that it's absolutely necessary for the authorities to target churches. He said the Communist Party sees churches as a real threat to the political system because they're very active. And over the last decade, he said they've become more and more powerful. He said not only that, but the house churches and Christians in the official churches have connections with the human rights lawyers, especially the Christian human rights lawyers, of whom there are a disproportionate number. So in a way, the crackdown simultaneously in Zhejiang and on the human rights lawyers is breaking this potential nexus between a civil society movement and the human rights community. Are there unintended consequences or positive consequences of this crackdown? One rather interesting irony here is that China's state security apparatus, the secret police, have essentially created a public relations disaster for China. Here's Wang Yu. This is the woman whose arrest set off China's biggest crackdown in years. The juxtaposition between this person, actually Wang Yu and I talked about this extraordinary juxtaposition, the juxtaposition between this person and a person who is threatening a state governing 1.4 billion people is an astonishing juxtaposition. This young lady here is 24 years old. She was recently graduated from law school and was working as an assistant in Melin Ping's law firm. She was swept up in the disappearance on the 10th of July. She has also disappeared. Nobody knows where she is, but she makes an extraordinarily compelling figure inside China and outside China for the media. Look at this article from the The Guardian, which has provided terrific coverage through this correspondent, Tom Phillips in Beijing. The day Zhao Wei disappeared, how a young law graduate was caught in China's human rights dragnet, and you won't be able to read the quote, "They must be torturing her," says Zhao's mother, as she desperately searches for the daughter who vanished 7 months ago. And then there is Zhang Kai, a leader of Christians, and you can see how a Chinese graphic artist has turned this into a crucifixion, drawing an analogy between Nero and people being burnt at the cross on the way to Rome, and Christians being persecuted in China on the way to the building in which Mao Zedong and other China's leaders stand in Tiananmen Square. A diplomat in China told me a few days ago that there's a staggering disjunction between the propaganda department in China and the public security department. Public security, not public security, state security, the secret police are essentially being given free rein. And it's creating a disaster for China with backlashes outside and inside the country. Another unexpected development is that family members are becoming more outspoken about their loved ones than has ever before been the case. We saw the quote from Zhao Wei's mother. Melin Ping's wife, who is a lawyer but actually is also a house church pastor in Beijing, has been absolutely indefatigable in constantly pressing the authorities and doing so through the social media and in other ways to find out where her husband is. Zhang Kai's mother recently published an open letter talking about the various national celebrations that she'd missed with her son, not knowing where he was. Somebody at Human Rights Watch, the China director of Human Rights Watch, told me recently that what's clear is that people are realizing that they can't trust being silent as a way of solving their problems. They're watching other family members go to the public through the social media, and they're following suit, hoping it will produce a better result. One of the other remarkable positive effects, you might say, at least for those of us who study the politics of lawyers, has been the mobilization of bar associations across the world. Within 2 weeks of this 9th of July crackdown, there was a major appeal to President Xi Jinping and China's leaders by a coalition of bar associations. And so you can see here the English Bar, the English Law Society, the German Bar Association, the Council of Bar Associations of Europe, Norwegian Bar Association, and French Bar Associations, and numbers of others. There have been also some extremely impressive statements from the City Bar of New York and from the Bar Associations of Canada, the US, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and the International Bar Association. Patrick Poon at Amnesty International, who tracks very closely what's going on inside China and has lots of channels back to him, told me a few days ago that this international pressure is very helpful. He said in the past we had to try very hard to get bar associations to respond on human rights issues. But he said now the issue, this crackdown, is about lawyers themselves. It's a crackdown on lawyers' practice, on lawyers' advocacy. So he said the current actions that we've seen over the last several months are unprecedented. He said, we've seen massive solidarity by so many lawyers around the world and law societies. And I'd like also to engage in a little special pleading here for the American Bar Foundation. We wanted to make some kind of impact because we had done so much research on this issue, and so many of the people who've been disappeared or detained have been part of our research projects for the last numbers of years. And so we joined with Human Rights Watch, with Eva Pils in London, and with a French anti-torture NGO to draft a letter, and then we worked our way around various parts of the world asking legal notables to sign this very strong letter, which is in your packets. Actually, please do help yourself when you leave the room a little bit later. The letter is in there, which holds to account the Chinese leadership and demands that they follow not only international standards, United Nations standards, but also China's own constitution and its laws. This was released on the 19th of January, simultaneously by the Guardian newspaper, with an article simultaneously timed in the New York Times. And in the following days, there were accompanying articles in the French newspaper Le Monde and in the German paper Die Welt. And then these rippled out to stories across the world. I asked Sophie Richardson, China Director at Human Rights Watch, whether we could imagine any effect of a letter like this. She said it's very difficult to quantify it. But she said governments are used to hearing Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch make a case about this or that human rights infraction. But when a different group of notables, when people they haven't heard from before, when people from across the world join together in a common document, they do take notice. And she thinks that it had a real influence on a very important letter that the US State Department issued, which I come to now. And that is a letter that the US lined up together with Australia, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the UK. A letter sent to the United Nations Human Rights Council stating its concern about this unprecedented set of actions in China's, quote, deteriorating human rights record, arrests and detentions of activists and lawyers, and other rights violations. Richardson thinks that the letter may have just given that extra impetus and shown the importance of this for the US and other governments. Other international organizations, of course, have been activated, international rights organizations, because Li Ping and Zhang Kai are Christians. Religious organizations across the world themselves have been mobilizing their members. Various entities of the United Nations, particularly the special rapporteurs on lawyers and on torture, have made statements, and international media stories continue. So let me conclude about what this augurs for the future. Our research indicates that these criminal defense and human rights lawyers are responding to the deepest ills of China's society. And there are many of them. They say and said that law and lawyers are the appropriate way to tackle those ills. Don't tackle them through violence. Don't tackle them through the petitioning system that the government began to object to. Tackle them through law. And that was the path that China followed roughly from 2000 until 2011 or 12. China's public roughly believed in this new rhetoric, of rule of law. Law could be the instrument of change. Law offered a non-violent, peaceful way forward. Law offered hope. For law to be real, lawyers themselves have to have human rights. And this, taken here from the logo of the Human Rights Defense Organization in Hong Kong, says if lawyers had no human rights, would there be a rule of law? And of course it's a rhetorical question because the answer must be no. And so now hope is disappearing in China. The economy is sliding. Pollution is shortening lives. Some of the greater freedoms earned over the last 2 decades are disappearing, especially for religious believers, free speech, freedom of association. The internet and the social media are becoming more heavily censored. China's great firewall between China and the world is growing higher and wider. And the peaceable paths for change are being taken off the table. All of them. So what kind of impact will this have on China's social and political stability? I and others talk about China as a pressure cooker. I don't know if any of you use or your parents use pressure cookers, but my mother used pressure cookers. And the idea of a pressure cooker, of course, is to steam food. And once the pressure builds up, the steam is released through a valve. And if the pressure cooker is not turned off enough, in enough time, the valve is blown off, and possibly the top of the pressure cooker is blown off. And China is such a place. But to change the metaphor, in the words of arguably the most distinguished law professor, constitutional scholar in China, He Weifang, he said, you can punish by way of trampling all over the law. And in so doing, you're fundamentally destroying the legitimacy of the government. Even though the government may find a temporary stability, in so doing, it is in a process of sowing hatred. You get temporary peace, but sooner or later the volcano will erupt. The flood will drown all. The president of China, Xi Jinping, appears to be making an enormous gamble. He's throwing all his dice on a party in complete control of its population, of concentrating power, of nationalistic drum beating, of brutality and force against dissenters. It's a path towards fear and terror and intensification of tyranny and, I would say, despotism. The fate of China's rights lawyers in this nationwide struggle is a litmus test of where goes China. I believe that the last 9 months since the 9th of July indicate that China is heading into a dark age of some sort. We don't know for how long. We don't know what the outcome will be. It's entirely unpredictable, most China specialists that I know will say. But we need to keep closely watching those lawyers, not only because we study lawyers, but the fate of those lawyers is going to tell us a lot about the future of China. Thank you.